Okay, hello, you're all very welcome to this session of the Teagasc National Beef Conference, which took place on November 21st in 2023 in Ballinasloe. On this session, we have Dr. Paul Crosson. Um, Paul is a principal research scientist based in Teagasc in Grange, and Paul is involved in looking at economic models around the whole area of beef production. So, Paul, you're very welcome to this session. The title of your paper that you gave at the beef conference was an overview of the updates and modifications that are being made to the Irish suckler breeding indexes. What we'll do is we'll go through the presentation and then we'll take a few questions then, Paul.
Perfect. Thanks, Pierce. Okay, thank you, Pierce, and hello, everyone. So in this presentation, as Pierce has said, I'm going to look at an overview of the changes that were made to the Irish suckler beef breeding indexes. And my name is on the presentation, but I should say that this is the culmination of a number of years' work by a working group between Teagasc and ICBF. My role on this working group was to develop the economic values that are used in the beef breeding indexes, and I'll explain that a little more as we go through the slides. But it's important for me to acknowledge the other people who have been involved in this work within Teagasc. Donna Berry and Alan Toomey were heavily involved, and from ICBF, Ross Evans, Mags Kelleher, and Siobhan Ring were heavily involved in this work. So, as I said, my role was around economic values and how they have changed. And I will focus mainly on that, but I'll also touch on the work carried out by the other members of the working group. So I suppose, firstly, in terms of what actually are the breeding indexes, I suppose, breeding indexes are essentially a value that is assigned to breeding cattle, in this case, breeding beef animals, bulls and cows, and they indicate the expected profit generated from the progeny of that animal relative to the average. So essentially what we're doing within beef breeding indexes and breeding indexes in general is we're combining traits that are economically or otherwise important within the system we are modelling. It helps farmers to select bulls and cows to breed from. And within the beef breeding indexes, we have two separate indexes because obviously we have animals being bred for beef. That's the purpose of our system. So we select those animals on the basis of the terminal index. And that provides us with an indication of the expected profit of finishing progeny. Secondly, we also breed animals to be our future suckler cows. And we call that the replacement index. And that gives us an indication of the expected profit of female progeny when raised to be suckler cows. So if we take just the example of the replacement index, this is a table or a pie chart of the relative emphasis of the various traits within the replacement index. So you can see there are many traits that are important, both from an economic perspective. If we look at calving, there's an economic, but also a labour and a management perspective within that. And we have some new traits around the environmental aspect that I will touch on as we go through the slides. So how have we progressed in respect of the beef breeding indexes over the last number of decades, really? So if we look at the genetic trends for the replacement and terminal indexes, we can see that they're both currently on an upward trend line, which is really positive. So we're both for both indexes, we have genetic gain of about €2 per year. But that has changed that hasn't always been the case and has changed over the past 2 decades. So if we look at the introduction of the suckler cow welfare scheme, at that time, our genetic trend for replacements was actually declining. So our suckler cows, in terms of their genetic potential to generate profit, was decreasing. The suckler welfare scheme provided much greater data availability to enable genetic evaluations to be developed with much greater clarity and much greater direction in terms of profitable systems. We were still somewhat declining at that stage. In around 2012, the indexes were then changed. We had the inclusion of the Grange beef model to generate economic values. and we had the greater distinction between replacement and terminal cattle. And probably the big change since then has been the introduction of the Beef Data Genomics Programme in 2015. Much greater availability of data. There was another review of the indexes which updated economic values. And since then, we have really seen the genetic trends for the replacement index going in very much in the right direction. And we currently have an average value for the terminal index of 71 euros and of the replacement index of 88 euros. So in general, the Eurostars are selecting for more profitable and efficient animals for Irish beef farmers. So the question could be asked, if we are going in the right direction, why change? Well, the last time we updated these indexes was in 2015. So a lot has changed, particularly around the market side. And I don't need to tell the people viewing here this presentation the changes that have occurred in terms of things like fertilizer price and feed price and so on. If we look at the CSO data there, for example, and we use January 2015 as our baseline of 100, we've seen really rapid escalation in prices, particularly since 2021, 2020. So market prices have changed very, very considerably. And that means that the focus on things like, the cost of feed, we now really need to be much more ruthless about taking feed costs out of our system. We also have some new traits that are worth considering within the indexes. For example, finishing age. Again, it comes back to the cost of producing cattle. If it takes longer to produce an animal at finish, that animal is costing money each day it's on the farm. So we do need to put out additional emphasis on finishing age, and that also has implications for emissions of the cattle, and I'll come to that in a moment. TB, we now have more information around TB within the beef herd, and we have information that provides us with a capacity to now breed or select animals that have greater likelihood of not being a reactor when there is an outbreak in a herd, and that's really important, particularly in certain parts of the country. And we have more information around carcass traits, in particular out of spec traits. We can now select for animals that aren't too light or aren't too heavy within the specs that are available, and equally on fatness. So we have new traits now that provide us with a capacity to improve the direction of our breeding. And the final big area worth considering is the climate agenda. We have a national policy to reduce emissions by 25% by 2030. In other words, 5.75 million tonnes. And that's a policy direction. But there's also, very clear signals from various member states within Europe or around the world that they are looking closely at the farming sector and indeed at all sectors, but just focusing on the farming sector here, that emissions need to either be costed within the system or emissions reductions incentivized. So we've also seen things like carbon farming coming into the policy agenda. In other words, providing an economic incentive for farmers to make decisions around how they farm their cattle and their land to reduce emissions. So with that in mind, the main updates that we intended to develop as part of this revision and the objectives were firstly to reduce the cost of producing beef cattle. And I just looked at the most recent Teagasc National Farm Survey suckling farm information, and the total cost per cow unit was almost 1,550 euros. If we compare that with the last time the indexes were reviewed in 2015, at that time the total cost per cow unit for suckling farms was just shy of 1,100 euros. So we've seen a really rapid escalation in cost, a really massive change in costs on farms. And again, we've all felt this and seen this in terms of the costs of providing inputs onto farms. So we need to reduce the cost. And that comes to issues around cow size. Within breed and with all else being equal, bigger cows consume more. So we do need to reduce cow size or maybe not reduce, but at least not increase the size of our cows and try and reduce the cost of feeding cows. Finishing age, I've mentioned already. Fertility, in the context where later calving cows have less capacity to make use of graze pasture in the spring. So fertility becomes really important. Also, cows or heifers that calve later for the first time, they cost more to produce. and fewer difficult calvings, you know, so the cost of difficult calvings, the cost of veterinary intervention, the supervisory costs that come with that. Of course, we're ultimately producing meat or weaned beef as output from the farm. We need to have revenue on our farm in order to generate profit. So we do want to increase the value of output. And that's where we have a focus on live weight performance. We want to continue to increase and improve live weight performance on our farms. But we want to do that at low cost. So it's about striking a balance between increasing output and reducing the cost of producing that output. And fertility is also a key component of output. In other words, where you have longer calving intervals, say, for example, the national average of 390 days, then you have lower output per year. And I'll come to that again in a moment. And we want to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really important that, you know, when we're speaking about carbon within the indexes and emissions, that we acknowledge that already really substantial amounts of greenhouse gas emissions have been removed from our beef cattle systems. We've taken more than 2 months of slaughter age in the last 10 years. That's 2 months lower emissions being generated on the farms without reducing carcass weight. So on our suckler farms, we have already made great progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the challenge here is to continue that progress and to provide the tools for us to do so. In terms of carbon, you know, this has already been deployed in the EBI, so the Dairy Breeding Index, and the DBI, the Dairy Beef Breeding Indexes, and they were deployed in 2023. And just to make a note that we're looking at absolute carbon emissions. So there's a lot of focus on methane and enteric methane. Within the framework that we have adopted here, we're looking at total emissions from the farm. So emissions associated with producing the feed, emissions associated with the slurry and the manure that's produced. So all of the emissions that are generated within the farm system. There's also some, I suppose, conversations around the methane breeding values that were published earlier this year. They're not included in the current evaluation, but we have included within the framework that when those breeding values are available for whole of life cycle, and that's important to emphasize that the current breeding values are for the finishing phase, and it's for that reason we did not deploy them in this current run. But when we have whole of life cycle breeding values, we have a framework there to include them within this current assessment. We assume a carbon price of €80 a tonne. So just to take an example of age at first calving, all else being equal, earlier calving produces lower quantities of carbon. So earlier first calving age equals less carbon. So if we look at a typical example, our production economics, so our conventional economics, the cost of feeding the animal when they calve older, is €1.76 per day. That's euros per day. So in other words, where we reduce first calving age, we save €1.76. There's also carbon output associated with older calving ages. So if we calve for the first time at 24 months and 1 day, compared to 24 months exactly, we produce an additional 1.4 kilos of CO2 equivalents, carbon dioxide equivalents. Putting €80 per tonne carbon value on that generates an economic value of 11 cents. Combining our 11 cents with our €1.76 gives us a combined economic value of €1.87. So that's and it's the exact same approach for the other traits within the breeding index. Okay, so reducing cost, I mentioned, is a key goal within this refinement of the breeding values and the economic values. And really what we're looking at in terms of reducing feed costs is, number one, to reduce the absolute amount of feed that animals are required to consume to produce a certain amount of beef. And number two, to have as much of that feed going into the animal in the form of grazed pasture. If we look at the relativity of feed costs, we're looking at 9.3 cents a kilo for grazed pasture, almost 21 cents a kilo for grass silage, and almost 40 cents a kilo for supplementary feed. So that's a 4:2:1 ratio in terms of supplementation with concentrates, supplementation with silage, and feeding at pasture. So really substantial differences in terms of the cost of feeds. Within the system, we have 68% grazed pasture, 26% grass silage, and 6% concentrates. That's across the system. And if we apply them to the cow phase or the calf to finish phase, that gives us a cost of the cow feeding 13 cents per kilo, and for the calf to finish 18 cents a kilo. So aspects that are important here: cow size, clearly important; finishing age, intake, breeding values are important, and the fertility components are particularly important as well. I mentioned finishing age as part of one of the important elements to reduce feeding costs. And this is some analysis that we carried out based on the farms that participated in the Teagasc Farmers Journal Better Farm programme. And we published this a number of years ago. If we look at farms or cattle on farms that were finished early, or the average or late, we can see a very obvious difference in the farm cost on a per hectare basis, going from €1,000 per hectare to almost €1,500 per hectare. So there was a real effect in terms of farm costs and feed costs of finishing age. And in that case, finishing age went from about 650 days to 850 days. So there was very, very strong evidence for reducing finishing age as a key component of reducing costs on beef cattle farms. Of course, that's while achieving a carcass fatness level. They must be commercially fit for slaughter. That is paramount. And while also maintaining as much of the carcass weight as possible. So finding that balance between cost of production and value of output. I mentioned fertility as well, and if we look within our breeding system, we're assuming a calving date of mid-March and a turnout date of mid-March, and a weaning and housing coinciding in and around the end of October with an average weaning weight of 330 kilos. So where you have longer gestation lengths or where you have longer calving intervals, that means you're calving later in the spring. Therefore, you have less grazed pasture in your diet and more grass silage in the diet. On the survival side, what we want is to minimize the number of replacements required to maintain the beef herd. And of course, there are important knock-on effects for the finishing phase. Later calving cows have later calved animals, and the birth date is slightly later in the season. Therefore, when those animals are housed at a fixed slaughter age, the duration indoors is slightly longer. So your ratio of indoor feeding to grazed pasture increases, thereby increasing feeding costs in the system. So that obviously has an important impact on total costs. I mentioned that the survival, in other words, the replacement rate of the herd is important, but also the age at which animals calve for the first time has a really substantial impact on costs. If we compare calving at 2 and 3 years of age, obviously calving at 3 years of age within a self-contained system, you're going to increase feed demand, and in many cases, you're going to increase the land area required within a fixed farming system. And looking at the national statistics, there are some positives that we can take from this. About a third of our heifers calve for the first time at in and around 2 years of age, so less than 26 months of age. Slightly less than a third calved in at 3 years of age. In other words, the effort is to calve at 2 years of age. Within a spring calving seasonal system, if they miss that window to calve at 2 years of age, the next window comes at about 3 years of age. Of course, we have some that slip from spring to autumn and autumn to spring, but those numbers are much lower. It really is a spring calving system. So we need to try and, breed animals and manage animals to have as many as possible calving at 2 years of age. Calving difficulty. So we revised the calving difficulty economic values. So labour costs have gone up, veterinary costs have gone up, and obviously there are implications for subsequent performance. So we need to reflect those in our revision of breeding values, particularly the labour aspect and the veterinary aspect of it. Where costs go up and where costs change over time, these need to be reflected in economic values so that we breed animals that are as best fit for purpose as we possibly can. The value of output, I mentioned at the outset, revenue is key to this system. Ultimately, we're about producing beef, either as weaned beef or as finished cattle. So live weight performance continues to be a key aspect of the emphasis within the breeding indexes. And each kilo of carcass weight within the breeding indexes and the revised economic values are now valued at €4.68. The milk effect, we know that most suckling farmers are not producing finished beef. Mostly we're producing weaned beef. So the milk effect is particularly important here. But we also take into account the cost of producing that milk and the heavier weanlings that emerge that are carried through to finish. So there are a number of aspects to this, but in aggregate, what we are looking for is more milk within our beef herd. And fertility, you know, I mentioned again in one of the earlier slides that our national calving interval is currently 390 days. So if you take, for example, a 300 kilogram weanling, that equates to 280 kilos of weaned output per year, because we're producing a weanling not once per year, but once every 390 days. So we have to reduce the weaned output in line with the average calf produced per year. And that's a loss of €65 per weanling. So that 390-day calving interval, it has a real effect when you annualize it. Okay, so when we put all this together, what does it mean? Well, let me first look at the terminal index and the change in relative emphasis within the terminal index. So the current terminal index, we have a weighting for carcass traits of about 50%, a weighting for calving traits, that includes gestation and mortality, of 21%, feed traits 16%, and other traits 13%. That other traits are the early maturing bonus, pollardness, docility, and so on, all coming to 13%. Now, when we update our economic values and when we incorporate the new traits within the index, what happens? Well, you can see carbon is coming in as a new trait at 6%. So all our traits add to 100%. So when you add a new trait, then that has to reduce the other traits to some extent. So our carcass traits now 47%. So from 50% to 47%. Calving traits from 21% to 20%. Feed traits actually go up from 16% to 18% because we also have a new trait within the feed traits, and that is slaughter age or finishing age. So feed, if you include slaughter or finishing age within the feed category, goes up from 16 to 18%. Other traits goes from 13 to 9%. So we include carbon at 6%, which slightly reduces the emphasis on other traits within the terminal index. Okay, so what happens within the maternal or the replacement index? So the first thing to note within the replacement index is we have two components to the replacement index. We have the traits that are expressed by the cow that results from the breeding decision that was taken. So the suckler cow that's produced from that breeding decision. But we also have to consider the beef traits of the calf produced by that suckler cow. In the current replacement index, the cow traits account for 61% of the emphasis, and the calf traits 39% of the emphasis. And you can see the breakdown within the cow traits: fertility 19%, milk 14%, cull value 7%, calving traits 4%, weight, in other words, the cost of feeding the cow 14%, and docility 4%. Within the calf traits, we have beef being the main one, 18%, calving at 8%, with gestation, feed, mortality, and other traits within that as well. So with the new economic values and the new traits, what you will see in aggregate is that your cow traits have gone from 61% to 57%, so slightly less emphasis on the cow traits, and your calf traits have gone from 39% to 43%. So we have slightly greater emphasis on the calf traits, and within the cow traits, fertility slightly less emphasis. So we still want to, and these revisions will still seek more fertile animals, just slightly less emphasis. We will still seek more milk, 11% emphasis, cull value 6, calving 3, weight 11, docility 3. We've now included carbon within the cow traits, 8% emphasis on carbon. Within the calf traits, beef remains at 18%, calving at 8%. And if we look at the other traits, they're relatively small within that. TB, one of the new traits, at 2%, and carbon also at 2%. So I guess in summary, Piers, what we would find and what we expect from the breeding policy arising from these changes in the economic values and new traits: better fertility, less calving difficulty, less calf mortality, and shorter gestation lengths. Lower feed costs, and that is a really, really important one. We want to reduce feed costs. That is a major challenge within our suckling systems. It's the #1 cost, and any breeding program in respect of beef cattle has to seek to reduce feed costs. Weaning weights, we want heavier weanlings. We want better carcass traits, better conformation, reducing finishing age earlier at appropriate fat score. We want quieter animals. We want more polled animals. We want more animals or a greater focus on meat eating quality. Presently, that's constituted as a breed bonus, but there are other aspects to meat eating quality that may come into focus in future. I mentioned age at finish. Clearly, earlier age at finish is preferred in the context of feeding, but also from an environmental perspective. And we want less susceptibility to TB when an outbreak occurs in a herd. So from a revenue perspective, greater weaned weight and heavier and better conformed carcasses with the appropriate fat score. Cost, we want lower suckler cow costs and lower progeny costs, better fertility, greater use of pasture, and lower finishing costs. So that is the direction that we are seeking to go, and that is the direction that the revised economic values and the new traits will be bringing us towards. So thanks for your attention.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. Okay, so that's very interesting. So, Paul, a couple of questions then in relation to the whole. The first thing, I suppose, question there is around carbon. So carbon is now being introduced to both the terminal and the replacement index. Has carbon already been introduced to other breeding indexes in this country? Yeah,
look, that's a really important point. You know, we have looked at carbon within our dairy beef and our EBI, our dairy indexes, and they were deployed in 2023. So carbon is a trait within the index, or a component of the economic values within the index, really, that has been under consideration for a while now. You know, clearly it's not one that is currently directly manifested within farmers' pockets in the context of you're not charged nor are you paid for reducing carbon. But if we look at the direction of travel, there is a very clear demand from policymakers, very clear demand from consumers, and we must bear in mind that we export, you know, 90% plus of what we produce, and international markets are increasingly asking us, you know, what are we doing to reduce carbon? So the focus on carbon has been on the table for a number of years, has been deployed in the dairy index and the DBI, and now it being deployed within the suckler breeding indexes.
Okay, great. And cost of feed is obviously a big one there. It's gone up, as you said, especially in the last two years. If the cost of feed came back down, Paul, and listen, we don't know will it or that, you know, but if for argument's sake, in 12 or 14 months' time, there was a drop in that, like, how soon could that be fed into an index change?
Yeah, I mean, look,
I suppose.
Yeah, and I suppose indexes aren't something you review every year. You know, you like to do them periodically, but certainly not every year, because it just creates that bit of flux that maybe you don't want on an ongoing basis. Equally, 8 years is a long time not to have had a review, and it's 2015 since we last did this, so probably that time is too long. So really, you're looking at 3 or 4 years. If we look at the last time the reviews were implemented was 2015. Prior to that was 2012. So that's probably a reasonable window. 2015, we then came into a BDGP scheme, and there was a view that, you know, we don't want to change goalposts, if you like, or move the goalposts in the middle of a really important scheme like that. We're now just moving into SCEP, There was a transition phase, and it seemed that that was a good time maybe to have these reviews. But certainly, if feed costs change, then that will be implemented into the next iteration of the index. But I mean, I think we are at a new baseline in terms of all our prices, beef price and input prices.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's interesting. So you brought up skep there, and obviously, you know, a lot of listeners will be very interested in is, you know, how is this going to affect their cows? Is there going to be a significant shift in terms of cows that were 4 and 5 star that are no longer going to be 4 and 5 star because of this? Is there any figures on that, Paul?
Yeah, so the figures we have from ICBF is that 85% of 4 and 5 star cows will stay 4 and 5 star cows, you know. So the vast majority of cows will remain within their star rating category, you know, from a skep perspective. Certainly some will fall out, and equally some will move into that category. So there is some small amount of movement within that, and obviously, you know, for individual herds that number could be much greater, you know, and indeed some herds might have no animals that move out of it. So it'll be very much on a herd by herd basis. As I said, the average is 85%, but we would very much be asking farmers to look at their own requirements in terms of skep and look at any changes within their breeding herd, and to make decisions based on what's happening there.
Okay, great. And I suppose just to finish up, Paul, I mean, there's not huge changes you're saying really to the terminal index. So if someone has a bull that's primarily there for terminal purposes that they're not really planning on keeping replacements from, there's a lot less chance that bull will change with these indexes. Am I right in saying that?
Correct. Yeah.
And then in terms of the replacement index, just I suppose to summarize, what's the type of cow, I suppose, if we're 5-10 years down the line from here and we heavily use the replacement index to select our replacement stock, kind of what's that kind of summary in terms of the traits we're looking to improve in that cow?
Yeah, so look at the traits. One of the big traits is going to be the cost of feeding that cow. And that's not necessarily, although cow size clearly is a part of that, but we also have, you know, a job of work to develop or to further develop the breeding values within those traits, you know. So a breed, obviously, within a genetic line, there is an effect of cow size, but across genetic lines, if you like, there might be breeding value differences between different genetic lines. So we want to identify animals that have lower feed costs, and that part of that will be cow size, but also progeny that will have lower feed costs. I think fertility is going to remain and has actually become even more important because of, number one, it crosses over a number of different aspects, but number one, feed cost, where you calve earlier, you get greater capacity to turn out to pasture in the spring. Where you calve earlier for the first time, you reduce cost to produce that heifer to the first time she calves. And also the impact of fertility on output. And sometimes that's a hidden cost within the herd because the cow calves, you know, every year. But if you lose a month or 6 weeks, the average output of that cow is actually reduced by the equivalent amount. So I think fertility is becoming particularly important, as well as direct cost of feeding that animal.
Okay, great. We're going to leave it there, Paul. Thanks very much for that, and thanks for presenting at the National Beef Conference. For viewers, if you want to see any other of the 5 presentations that were given on the evening of the 21st November, there'll be a link at the end of this video. If you follow that link, you can go to our webpage where you'll see all the other presentations. We leave it there. Thank you.